So I cut my recent month-long Italy trip short by 2 weeks because I screwed up, guys. Mistakes were made, rookie mistakes. And here's what I did wrong, from the location selection to lodging to my airline tickets. And I'm gonna share it all with you so that you don't make the same mistakes on your next trip. Now, I've been on plenty of solo adventures, both in the United States and abroad, and I've loved every single one. But this time things were different, way different. So different, in fact, that I actually cut the trip short by 2 weeks. I was super excited to head back to Italy and to go on this trip because it was my first overseas venture since the pandemic. Ugh, remember that? I think that was part of the reason why I made these mistakes, because in all my excitement, I neglected some key things. Now, if you're a solo traveler or you're considering becoming one, I know you're probably concerned about things like loneliness, safety, health issues, and you're not alone in that. I've actually done a couple of videos dealing with loneliness and fear when traveling solo, lots of other videos. I'll link those two below for you. Those were actually not the mistakes or the issues that I dealt with on this trip, and I'll dive into what I did deal with in a moment. But first, I want to reiterate that I think solo travel is fantastic. It builds your confidence, lets you overcome challenges, gives you a deep sense of introspection. Plus, there's just the sheer joy of doing what you want when you want. But if you find that your trip isn't quite what you expected, like I did this go around, examining what went wrong can help to avoid it happening again. With the benefit of hindsight, I can pinpoint where I went wrong, and I'm sharing this with you so that you don't make the same mistakes. I'm going to be a little vulnerable with you here. I occasionally deal with anxiety, and that can spiral into a panic attack. This started about 10 years ago with me, and I've picked up coping skills along the way, plus I keep medication on hand just in case, breathing exercises, meditation, mindful media consumption, and a good diet. That all helps me to stay steady. But when you're traveling, some of that can just get a little out of whack. And as anyone who's faced extreme anxiety knows, it can sometimes just hit you out of nowhere. And on this trip, it hit me hard, like debilitating hard. After just a few days in Italy, I found myself struggling to leave my Airbnb because of the massive anxiety that crept in. For me, that manifests into shortness of breath, lightheadedness, that awful feeling of just being out of control. And I think I was triggered by a combination of the mistakes that I made along the way. So keep in mind, even if you don't suffer from any anxiety, learning from what I did wrong can help make your next trip a fabulous one. So what did I do wrong? And more importantly, how can you avoid making the same mistakes? Let's dive right into it. First, let's talk about location. Now, I've been to Italy before. This was actually my 4th time. So I thought I knew what I was getting into. But this trip was in August, for the entire month of August, not October like my previous visits. And wow, was it hot. I'm talking nearly 100 degrees every day. And in Italy, that means you're dealing with old buildings, ancient ruins, not very much air conditioning. And when there is air conditioning, it's usually one of these window type units that doesn't really cool things down like we're used to in the States. So I found myself hiding out in my Airbnb for most of the day and only venturing out in the early morning and in the evening, when honestly it was still pretty hot. So lesson number 1, seriously consider the weather when planning your trip. If it's going to be sweltering and you're in a place with lots of walking, little AC, and tons of tourists, maybe seriously think about a different location. And I knew these things going in because this wasn't my first trip to Italy, and I also had researched what it would be like in August, but actually being there during that time and feeling all of that was completely different. Of course, guys, this was not an inexpensive trip, so I really would have benefited from selecting a cooler summer climate like Austria or Switzerland or Norway. I've never been to any of those places, and I could have easily planned a trip there for close to the same amount of money that I was spending on my Italian trip. Next up, lodging. I did all the right things or so I thought. I researched the neighborhood. I zoomed in on pictures. I made sure that the Airbnb I selected had air conditioning, and I read all the reviews. But when I arrived, I realized I had made a mistake. First, the apartment wasn't as nice as the pictures made it seem, and the neighborhood I selected was a less touristy area. And I did that on purpose because I knew this was going to be a time of year that it would be really crowded in those tourist areas. So it was kind of on the fringe of the more touristy spots. Not as convenient as I had hoped. And in 100-degree weather, everything I did felt like a chore because I had to walk further. I was on the fringe. And there weren't as many restaurants and cafes to just pop into. So lesson number 2, if you're going somewhere hot, book accommodations close to the sites you want to visit and near restaurants, cafes, things that you're going to need on your trip. What might not matter in mild weather can become a huge issue in extreme weather, heat or cold. And lastly, the airline. So the mistake I made was not booking my flights in advance. I did book my flights well in advance, but I was chasing the lowest price. And I got a good deal and booked a low price. But my outgoing flight from Italy was super early in the morning, and that is something that I always avoid. But for this trip, I thought it was so important for me to snag that cheap airfare, it really wasn't worth it, especially when I was experiencing heavy anxiety. Plus, I booked the cheapest fare with no flexibility to make changes. Another rookie mistake that I should have known better. I don't normally do that, but I did because I got excited about that fare. So consider what's really important to you when you're booking airfare and what that's really going to feel like when you're on your trip and you have to get up at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. to try to get to an airport in a foreign country. It's probably not worth it. So solo travel, still one of my favorite things to do, incredibly enriching, but it is important to plan wisely. If you don't want to make the mistakes I did, consider the weather and the location you're going to, pick the right lodging, and don't skimp on airline flexibility. I'd love to hear your experiences. Have you faced similar challenges on your travelers? If so, drop me a comment below, and I do have tons of other travel-related videos. I'd really love connecting with you all. Thanks and safe travels.